Let me begin with something that most people in this conversation get completely backwards. When we talk about narcissism, and we need to talk about it, because it is quietly destroying the health of millions of people, particularly those of us who have lived long enough to carry decades of its damage. We almost always start in the wrong place. We start with the behavior. We start with the cruelty, the manipulation, the cold indifference that can strip a person of their identity over months, over years, sometimes over an entire lifetime. And yes, those behaviors are real. The damage they cause is real. But if we only ever look at the surface, we will never understand what we are actually dealing with. And if we don't understand what we are dealing with, we cannot break it. So let's go deeper. Let's go to the place that most people are afraid to look. Every narcissist you have ever encountered, every person who has made you feel invisible, disposable, confused about your own reality, was once a child. And that child, at some point in their early life, experienced something unbearable. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily what the world would call obvious trauma. Sometimes it was a mother who was emotionally unavailable, a father whose love was conditional on performance, a home where vulnerability was met not with comfort but with contempt or silence. And that child learned something, a lesson so early and so deep it became biological. It became wired into the nervous system. They learned that their authentic self was not safe to show the world. This is the wound. This is where it all begins. What happens next is where we need to pay very close attention, because this is the mechanism that runs beneath every manipulation, every cycle of idealization and discard, every moment of gaslighting that leaves the people around a narcissist questioning their own sanity. The child who learns that their true self is dangerous does not simply accept that wound and move on. The human psyche does not work that way. Instead, the child constructs a self, a false self, times at first. In the next, a carefully built armor of superiority, of charm, of grandiosity, designed not to impress, but to survive. Designed to ensure that the original wound, that core belief that says, I am fundamentally not enough, never has to be felt again. And this is critical. That false self requires constant feeding. It requires the admiration, the submission, the emotional energy of the people around it to maintain its structure. Because the moment the admiration stops, the moment someone refuses to reflect back the image the narcissist has constructed of themselves, the false self begins to crack, and beneath that crack is the terrified child. The original wound, the unbearable emptiness that the entire architecture of narcissism was built to avoid. Now, you might be sitting with some discomfort right now, because understanding the wound doesn't make the abuse acceptable. Then next, it doesn't ask you to excuse what was done to you or to the people you love. Compassion and accountability are not opposites, and anyone who tells you that understanding someone's pain means you must tolerate their behavior has confused wisdom with weakness. But here's why this matters. Here is why we must begin here, with the wound, before we talk about anything else. Because you cannot break a cycle you do not understand. You cannot exit a trap you cannot see, and the narcissist's greatest power over you is not their cruelty. And the narcissist's greatest power over you is not their cruelty. It is your confusion about what they actually are. The wound is not your responsibility to heal, but understanding it is your first act of freedom. Now that we understand the wound, we need to map the territory. Because one of the most insidious things about narcissistic abuse is not any single moment of cruelty. It is the pattern, the repeating, predictable, almost mechanical pattern that the narcissist cycles through, often without any conscious awareness that they are doing it. And the reason this pattern is so devastating, particularly for those of us who have lived inside it for years or decades, is that it is designed, not deliberately, but structurally, to keep you permanently off balance, to keep you reaching, to keep you hoping, to ensure that you never quite find solid ground beneath your feet long enough to ask the question that would end everything. Why does this keep happening to me? So let's name it. Let's pull it into the light where it loses some of its power. The cycle has 4 stages, and once you see them clearly, you will never be able to unsee them. The first is idealization. This is the stage that hooks you, and it hooks even the most intelligent, self-aware people. So there is no shame in having been caught by it. This is the stage where the narcissist makes you feel like the most extraordinary person they have ever encountered. Their attention is total. Their affection feels almost supernatural in its intensity. They mirror back to you your deepest desires, your values, your sense of humor, your dreams, because they are gifted, whether consciously or not, at reading what a person needs and becoming exactly that. Psychologists sometimes call this love bombing, but that term barely captures the experience. It feels less like a tactic and more like finally being truly seen for the first time in your life. And that feeling of being deeply seen and chosen is precisely what makes the second stage so shattering: devaluation. This is where the mask begins to slip, though it slips so gradually at first that most people don't recognize what is happening. The warmth cools. The criticism begins. Subtle at first, dressed as concern or humor, then increasingly direct. The things they once adored about you become the very things they hold in contempt. You find yourself working harder and harder to get back to that first stage, to recapture the warmth, to understand what you did wrong. And this is not weakness. This is your nervous system responding exactly as it was designed to respond, seeking safety, seeking connection, trying to repair what feels broken. The tragedy is that the more you reach, the more power you surrender. Then comes the discard, which can be sudden or slow, dramatic or quiet. But it is always disorientating, because it arrives before you have had time to process the devaluation. You are left not just with loss, but with profound confusion about reality itself, about who you are, about whether any of it was ever real. And then, just when you have begun to breathe again, just when you have started to reclaim some fragment of yourself, the hoovering begins. The return, the apology, the charm, the intensity that pulls you back into idealization. And the cycle begins again. This is not love. This is not even a relationship in any meaningful psychological sense. It is a system. So, but 'tis a closed loop of extraction, running on your emotional energy, maintained by your hope, and powered by your profound, generous, and tragically misplaced belief that if you love someone hard enough, they will finally become capable of loving you back. The cycle is not random, and neither is your suffering. So we have named the wound. We have mapped the cycle. Now we need to ask the question that almost nobody asks, and it is the question that changes everything. Why do some people keep getting pulled back in? Because here is what the self-help world almost always gets wrong about this conversation. It locates the problem entirely in the narcissist. It says, here is the toxic person, here is the damage they cause, here is how to spot them and run. And that is not wrong, exactly, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because the narcissist does not choose their victims randomly. They are not casting a wide, indiscriminate net. They are again not consciously, but structurally, drawn with almost magnetic precision toward a very specific type of person. A person with an enormous capacity for empathy. A person who feels deeply, forgives readily, and carries within them an almost unshakable belief in the goodness and the potential of the people they love. We call these people empaths, and the painful, urgent truth that we need to sit with is this. Ordinary empathy in the presence of a narcissist does not protect you. It endangers you. Let me explain why. Apathy, at its core, is the capacity to feel what another person feels, to step inside their experience, to hold their pain alongside your own, to respond to their suffering with care rather than contempt. This is one of the most beautiful and necessary qualities a human being can possess. In a healthy relationship between two people capable of genuine reciprocity, empathy is the very foundation of intimacy. It is what makes us truly knowable to one another. But place that same empathy in proximity to a narcissist, and something deeply troubling happens. Because the narcissist, remember, is running from a wound. They are in constant, unconscious flight from an unbearable inner emptiness. Tend when they encounter a person who responds to pain with compassion, who interprets cruelty as a cry for help, who believes that love and patience can reach anyone they have found. Not a partner, but a source, an unlimited, self-replenishing source of exactly the emotional energy their false self requires to survive. And the empath, the ordinary empath, keeps giving it, because their empathy tells them to. Because they can feel somewhere beneath the narcissist's behavior that original wound, that frightened child. And every instinct they possess says, if I can just reach that child, if I can just love them enough, if I can just love them enough, if I can just be patient enough and present enough and forgiving enough, they will heal. We will get there. This will become what it felt like at the beginning. This is not naivety. Please understand that. This is not stupidity, and it is not weakness. It is one of the most profound expressions of human compassion turned against itself. The empath's greatest strength becomes the mechanism of their own destruction, because they are applying a tool of healing to a situation that does not want to be healed. The narcissist system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function, and it was designed to consume. There is something else here that we must name, particularly for those of us in the later chapters of life. Many empaths carry their own wounds, their own early experiences of conditional love, of emotional neglect, of being valued for what they gave rather than who they were. And those wounds create a terrible familiarity with the narcissist dynamic. It does not feel dangerous. It feels like home. Compassion without boundaries is not a virtue. It is an open wound, dressed as a gift. So if ordinary empathy fails, if the very depth of feeling that makes an empathy beautiful is also what makes them vulnerable, then we have to ask the next question. And this is where the conversation shifts. This is where we stop talking about victimhood and start talking about power. What makes a super empath differ? Because the term itself can sound like something invented for social media, a hierarchy of sensitivity, a flattering label. And I want to be very clear that I am not using it that way. When I talk about the super empath, I am talking about something precise and psychological. I am talking about a specific configuration of human experience. Someone who has walked through the fire of deep emotional sensitivity, who has lived inside dynamics that would collapse a less feeling person, and who has come out the other side not hardened, not closed, but fundamentally awake, awake to themselves, awake to others, and awake crucially to the difference between the two. The ordinary empath feels everything and loses themselves in it. The super empath feels everything and does not lose themselves. That distinction sounds simple. It is anything but. Here is what the super empath carries that the ordinary empath has not yet developed. First, and this is foundational, they have a ferocious relationship with their own inner world. They have done the work, whether through suffering or through conscious practice, or most often through both, of knowing themselves at a level that most people never reach. They know their triggers, they know their wounds, they know the specific emotional signatures that arise in their body when something is wrong. That particular tightening in the chest, that low-level anxiety that has no name but carries a clear message, and they have learned, through enormous pain, to trust those signals rather than override them in service of someone else's comfort. This self-knowledge is not selfishness. It is the opposite of selfishness. It is the opposite of selfishness. Because a person who knows themselves clearly cannot be easily rewritten, cannot be gaslit into doubting their own perception, cannot be gradually reshaped by a narcissist's relentless, subtle campaign of reality distort. Twine because they have an internal reference point that remains stable, even when everything around them is being deliberately destabilized. The second thing the super empath carries is what I would call witnessed compassion. They can see the narcissist's wound. They can feel it, even without being governed by it. This is an extraordinary and rare capacity. Most people either cannot see the wound at all and respond only to the behavior, or they see the wound so clearly that it overrides every boundary and every instinct for self-protection. The super empath holds both simultaneously. They see the frightened child beneath the armor, and they also see the armor, and they understand, with a clarity that has been earned through lived experience, that acknowledging someone's pain does not obligate you to absorb it. And the third thing, the thing that makes the super empath genuinely dangerous to the narcissistic cycle, is their relationship with boundaries. Not boundaries as rules, not boundaries as walls, boundaries as an expression of self-respect so deep and so steady that it does not require the narcissist's agreement to exist. The super empath does not need the narcissist to understand the boundary or validate it or even acknowledge it. They simply hold it quietly, completely, and without apology. This is what the narcissist cannot metabolize. Not anger, not confrontation, not pleading or explaining or reasoning. Stillness, clarity, a self that refuses to be reshaped. The super empath does not fight the narcissist. They simply refuse to disappear. Now, I want to turn to something that this conversation almost never addresses directly. And it is something that I believe deserves not just acknowledgement, but urgent, unflinching attention. Because everything we have discussed so far, the wounds, the cycle, the failure of ordinary empathy, the particular power, for super empath, applies to human beings at every stage of life. But there is something specific, something qualitatively different about what happens when decades of narcissism abuse meet an aging body and an aging nervous system. And if we are going to be honest about the full cost of this cycle, we have to go here. We have to talk about what this does to the body. And we have to talk about what it does to the body of someone who has been carrying it for 40, 50, 60 years or more. The science here is not speculative. It is not the language of therapy rooms and self-help books. It is measurable, biological, and in many cases irreversible. When a human being lives in a chronic state of emotional threat. And make no mistake, narcissistic abuse is precisely that. A relentless, low-grade state of threat that the nervous system registers as clearly as physical danger. The body responds accordingly. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, floods the system. The immune system, which requires stability and safety to function optimally, begins to dysregulate. Inflammation, which underlies almost every major chronic illness we know of, heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, certain cancers, increases. The body, in its profound intelligence, has been keeping score of every moment of gaslighting, every discard, every cycle of hope and devastation, and it presents the bill. For younger people, the body has reserves. It has plasticity. It can absorb a significant amount of chronic stress before the structural damage becomes visible. But for those of us in the later chapters of life, those reserves have been drawn down. Present that has spent decades in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning, always bracing, always bracing, always reading the emotional weather of the room to predict the next storm, is a nervous system that has been running at full capacity, times at first. And the consequences of that are not metaphorical. They show up in the cardiologist's office. They show up in the rheumatologist's blood work. They show up in the sleep that never quite restores, in the anxiety that has become so familiar it no longer feels like anxiety. It just feels like personality. There is something else that happens to older adults who have spent their lives inside narcissistic dynamics, and it is perhaps the most quietly devastating consequence of all. The erosion of identity that the narcissist engineers, that gradual systematic dismantling of your sense of self, your trust in your own perception, your belief in your own worth, does not simply affect your emotional life. It affects your cognitive life. It affects your cognitive life. There is substantial and growing evidence that chronic psychological stress, particularly the kind generated by emotionally abusive relationships, accelerates cognitive decline, that the brain, like the body, carries the accumulated weight of years of living in contradiction, being told that what you feel is not real, that what you remember did not happen, that who you are is fundamentally deficient. And yet, and this is what I need you to hear, the brain also retains, at every age, a capacity for healing that we have consistently and catastrophically underestimated. Neuroplasticity does not stop at 60, as it does not stop at 70. The nervous system that learned fear can learn safety. The identity that was dismantled can be rebuilt, but only if we first tell the truth about the full weight of what was carried. Your body was never the problem. It was keeping you alive through something that should never have been asked of it. We have traveled a considerable distance together in this conversation. We have looked at the wound that creates the narcissist. We have mapped the cycle that traps the empath. We have acknowledging, and honestly, and without softening, what decades of that cycle does to the body and the mind of someone who has carried it into the later chapters of their life. And now we arrive at the place that everything before this has been building toward. Because understanding the problem, as necessary as that is only ever half the work. The other half is this, what actually breaks it. And the answer, when we arrive at it clearly, is both simpler and more radical than most people expect. Boundaries. Boundaries as a concept, not boundaries as a line in a self-help workbook that you write down and then feel guilty about enforcing. Not boundaries as a negotiation or a conversation or a request for the narcissist understanding and cooperation, because here is what years of working with and studying these dynamics makes unmistakably clear. You will never successfully negotiate a boundary with someone whose entire psychological architecture depends on those boundaries not existing. The narcissist system requires access. It requires your emotional availability, your self-doubt, your willingness to re-enter the cycle every time the hoovering begins. A boundary, a real one, is not an inconvenience to that system. It is an existential threat to it. And this is precisely why the super empath is the only one equipped to hold it. Because boundaries of the kind we are talking about here, the radical, non-negotiable, self-sovereign kind, require something that most people, including most empaths, have not yet developed. They require the capacity to tolerate the narcissist's response to the boundary without collapsing. And that response will come. It will be disproportionate. It will be designed to destabilize. It will press on every wound the empath carries with surgical, if unconscious, precision. The guilt, the fear of abandonment, the deep-seated belief, planted early and dough-watered consistently, that their needs are too much, their self-protection is selfishness, their refusal to re-engage is cruelty. The ordinary empath encounters that response and folds, not because they are weak. We have already established that weakness has nothing to do with it, but because their empathy extends even to the narcissist's manufactured distress. They feel the pain their boundary is causing and interpret that feeling as evidence that the boundary is wrong. The super empath feels it too, every bit of it, and holds the boundary anyway. This is what makes boundaries medicine rather than merely strategy. When the super empath holds a boundary in the presence of a narcissist's full force response, the rage, the victimhood, the charm offensive, the appeals to history and love and shared memory, and does not move, something shifts in the dynamic that cannot be undone. The cycle, which depends on the empath's eventual return, encounters a wall it cannot dissolve. And for the first time, the loop has no exit back into itself. There is something profound here that extends beyond the personal. When we talk about boundaries as medicine, we are talking about them in the same way we would talk about any genuine therapeutic intervention, as something that does not merely manage symptoms, but addresses the underlying condition. The underlying condition, in this case, is the belief that your presence in this world is conditional on your willingness to be consumed by it. A boundary is not a wall between you and another person. It is the line where you end and begin simultaneously, where you finally, completely meet yourself. There is something that happens when a super empath finally breaks the narcissistic cycle that the self-help world consistently undersells. It describes the moment in individual terms, as personal liberation, as the reclaiming of one life on T-identity, one future, and it is all of those things, but it is also something larger, something that extends far beyond the person who made the decision to stop disappearing. And if we are going to understand the full magnitude of what breaking this cycle actually means, we need to zoom out. We need to look not just at the individual, but at the family system, at the generational pattern, at the invisible thread of unhealed pain that runs through bloodlines like a current, passing from parent to child to grandchild with the same quiet devastation as any inherited disease. Because narcissistic abuse does not begin with the narcissist you know, and it does not end with you, unless you make it end with you. Let us think about this carefully. We established at the very beginning of this conversation that narcissism is a wound, a survival response to early emotional deprivation, to a childhood environment in which the authentic self was not safe to inhabit. Next. And that wound, if it is never examined, never brought into consciousness, never healed, does not stay contained within the person who carries it. It radiates outward. It radiates outward. It shapes the emotional environment of every relationship that person enters. It determines the atmosphere of the home their children grow up in. Those children, absorbing that atmosphere not as an anomaly, but as the definition of normal, of love, of what relationships feel like, carry it forward. They either replicate the narcissistic pattern themselves, or they develop the profound empathic sensitivity of someone who learned to read emotional weather as a survival skill. And so the cycle perpetuates, not through malice, through inheritance. This is why the super empath act of breaking free is never merely personal. It is archaeological. It reaches backward through time to the generations of unprocessed pain that produce this moment. And it says here, it stops here, not in anger, not in blame, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of someone who has finally seen the pattern whole and refused to pass it forward. And think about what this means for those of us who are grandparents, who have grandchildren watching, with those extraordinarily perceptive young eyes, how the adults in their lives navigate love and conflict and self-worth. Children do not learn relationships from what they are told. They learn from what they witness. They learn from the emotional texture of the environment they are raised inside. A grandparent who breaks a narcissistic cycle, who models what a boundary looks like, what self-respect feels like, what it means to love without surrendering your identity, is giving those children something that no school, no therapist, no book can fully replicate. They are giving them a different definition of normal. There is a concept in intergenerational trauma research that I find both sobering and profoundly hopeful. It is the idea that healing does not just move forward in time, that when we do the work of understanding and integrating our own wounds, we somehow shift the weight of what came before us as well. It is as though consciousness applied to inherited pain does not merely stop its forward transmission, but retroactively lightens the load of those who carried it without knowing what it was. You are not just breaking a cycle. You are rewriting what your family understands love to mean. And that is perhaps the most powerful thing one human being can do for another. And this is where the real work begins. Because leaving the cycle, physically, emotionally, legally, is one thing. But reclaiming who you were before the cycle is an entirely different journey. And in many ways, a more demanding one. Someone has spent years, sometimes decades, inside a narcissistic dynamic. They don't just lose time, they lose authorship. The narcissist, by design, becomes the editor of your inner world, deciding which of your perceptions are valid, which of your feelings are reasonable, which version of yourself is acceptable. Then, because this happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, most people don't realize how thoroughly their sense of self has been rewritten until they're standing on the other side of it, trying to remember who they were before someone else held the pen. This is particularly acute for the super empath, because the very qualities that make them extraordinary, their sensitivity, their attunement, their capacity to feel deeply into another person's experience, those same qualities were weaponized against them. They were taught systematically that their emotional intelligence was too much, that their insight was controlling, that their need for genuine connection was needy. Over time, the super empathologize their own gifts, begins to pathologize their own gifts. They don't just doubt themselves, they learn to distrust the most essential parts of themselves. And then, when the relationship ends, there's this disorienting silence, the constant external noise, the criticism, the gaslighting, the hot and cold. It stops. And what's left is not peace. Not immediately. What's left is a person who has been so conditioned to see themselves through another's distorted lens that they no longer know how to see themselves at all. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk talks about how trauma doesn't just change what we think, it changes what we feel in our bodies as true. The super empath who has been told repeatedly that their perception is wrong doesn't just carry a cognitive distortion, they carry a somatic one. Their nervous system has learned to override their own instincts. Rebuilding identity, then, is not simply a matter of positive affirmations or journaling. Though take I, se have their place, it is a neurological and psychological retraining, learning to sit with an internal signal and choose to honor it rather than immediately question it. This becomes even more layered for those encountering this work in the later chapters of life, because when you were in your 50s, your 60s, looking back at a marriage or a long-term relationship that consumed some of your most generative years, there is grief that goes beyond personal loss. There is grief for the version of yourself you never fully got to inhabit, the career you didn't pursue, the boundaries you never felt safe enough to hold, the creative life, the authentic voice, the unguarded laugh, all of it placed in suspended animation while you manage someone else's fragile ego. But here is what I want you to hold on to. Identity is not as fragile as we fear. It is more like a language than a structure. You may not have spoken it fluently in years, but it has not been lost. The self that was present before the conditioning, curious, perceptive, alive with feeling, that self did not disappear. It went quiet. It learned to survive by becoming invisible, and the work of reclaiming it is simply and profoundly the practice of making it safe enough to be seen again, first by yourself, and then, carefully, by others. You are not starting over. You are starting from a depth of self-knowledge that most people never reach.